All right, so thank you for the invitation, first of all. And I'm Russel Witte, and thank you for the introduction. I just have to have a couple disclosures. One is I'm not representing the University of Arizona in any way. I have to kind of say that because the universities have their own position. I don't even know what mine is in terms of this topic. So I'm here to share my expertise and try to show you a lot of truths in terms of evidence and facts, and then let people decide what kind of technology they want to work with moving forward and in the future, because that's what it should be about, right? So I'm going to cover a lot of material tonight, partly because I always share my slides, so you're going to have a lot of resources embedded in those that afterwards that you'll be able to go back to and look at. So in some cases, I might kind of go quick through them, but just remember you'll be able to look at them. Usually if you see something underlined in my slides, it means there's a link you can click on when you have the PDF and kind of go to that. Not always the case, but usually the case. So this is kind of what it looks like in Arizona. I imagine you probably have some, maybe the background's a little different, but similar sorts of views in Pennsylvania and around the country. And this is related to the 5G wireless infrastructure. And we're going to get into more detail and look at this in a lot of different angles here. One thing we want to keep in mind is that this technology is part of a kind of what I would call smart city agenda that requires small cells to pretty much be every 500 feet, according to industry, not just in your city, but across the entire planet. So that's about 3 homes. There's cases where we do see separations like that with multiple towers. I've even seen it probably here in Tucson, even 150 feet, 2 towers right next to each other that look like these. So it kind of gives you an idea. The other thing that this technology is related to, the Internet of Things, which is about monitoring everything and everybody 24/7. So we'll look at a little more on what that really means, and also introduce IOB, which is Internet of Bodies. Okay. That's part of Internet of Things, and that's tracking people and your body and electrical signals and other signals related to your physiology. And then ultimately, this technology will add and is adding harmful pulsed microwave radiation to our neighborhoods. And I can say that calmly because, or confidently, because of the vast literature, scientific literature, over the last more than 100 years that goes into this, which we will share a small part of it. But did you actually know that this concept of 5G microwave technology is not really that new? I mean, here's an article from 1947, Popular Science. I encourage anyone, if you can find it, to go read it. But here's a quote: "Invisible network will handle phone rails, telegram, television, FM, AM radio, complete newspapers, even carrier mail." This was a vision of using technology, specifically microwave technology, to connect everything and everybody 24/7. And this was published in 1947 with quite a bit of detail of how that was going to be brought out. So what happened to that technology? Well, let's look at one other thing around that era. Let's go before World War II. The technocracy movement that some of you probably heard of, which was kind of started in that era around Columbia University. But it was the idea that still exists today that science and technology can pretty much solve the world's problems. Okay, so this is from the magazine The Technocrat, 1938, and you can just read these quotes. And this is from Patrick Wood, who just recently presented them. So I said, this is good. So let's see what's happened in 1938. This is pre-World War II. Technocracy is the science of social engineering, the scientific operation of the entire social mechanism to produce and distribute goods and services to the entire population. There will be no place for politics, politicians, finance, or financiers. Technocracy will distribute by means of a certificate of distribution available to every citizen from birth to death. So the problem with both the microwave and this incredible technology that even existed in 1947 and this idea of science and technology solving the world's problem was that it was basically rejected by the public, who had a pretty good understanding, even at that time, the problems with radar transmitters on health, but also the fact that World War II, Germany, Nazi Germany in particular, used the same principles to kind of coerce the world into a certain direction. So people were much more up to speed of what was going on. So the technocracy movement was flat out rejected. It didn't disappear. And at that time, before World War II, was kind of popular. So anyway, so really, what is 4G, 4G, 5G is really just a rebranding. It's all microwave radiation. We can look at different parts of the spectrum, but let's just start at 4G because that's what we're most familiar with, which is pretty much up to about 3 gigahertz. These terms are often moving targets with industry. They'll change the meaning every now and then. So in terms of physics, we can't really define them very clearly, but they're pretty much different bands of microwave radiation. 5G includes 4G. It requires 4G. So when you get up to the higher frequencies, to 3 gigahertz to 30 gigahertz and even higher, they work in synergy together to basically achieve the outcome that they're intended to do. And ultimately that's tracking everything and everybody 24/7, okay? So this is the kind of the good side of at least the way it's sold, is that they'll have these smart cities and the Internet of Things, and everything will be very energy efficient, and we'll be able to talk to people and communicate, and everything will be very efficient. So we kind of have a good idea of what's being sold by industry in terms of what this technology can do. And it uses pulse modulated microwave radiation to achieve that. But you can also now find things, especially over the last couple of years, of how this would be implemented for actually tracking people, bodies, physiology, detecting illness, testing for disease. This is a patent from Richard Russel from 2020. You can go look this up. It's system and method for testing for COVID-19. It's got a nice software interface. It can target athletes, people in the hospital, bicycling, and you can look at heart rate, et cetera, temperature, and actually do diagnostics. So this technology is publicly described in the literature. I'm just giving you an example of what's here and what's to come, unless we decide that maybe we don't want to embrace this technology, and maybe there's even better technology out there, whether that's fiber, or maybe there's even other kinds of wireless technology that doesn't involve radiation. Okay, so you can go in and look at that patent because it kind of gives you the good ideas of what might be coming our way. But the whole point is that everything and everybody is connected to this grid 24/7, and that means everything. That even Pampers has a diaper with a wireless transmitter in it to tell you when it's time to change your baby's diaper. The problem is, it also tells everybody else, your neighbors or anybody else that wants to tap into the communication network, they will be able to use that information, for example, to build better products because they can look at the interactions, et cetera. So it's not clear if we necessarily need that, but the real question is this really inevitable? This type of utopia that we've been sold, and do we even have a say? Okay. So we got to kind of use this concept as just a guiding principle, because we can talk about 5G and microwaves, but I'm sure we could go into a lot of other topics and think on and use the same sorts of thinking and principles. A lot of us are influenced by marketing and propaganda. In fact, most of our lives we have been. And the truth is that marketing has a powerful effect on human perception. So we have to be very careful getting our information, facts, and evidence solely from marketing, if not exclusively from other sources. But here's examples of maybe why. Here, this was a photo from Stanford University. This was part of the marketing campaign where you see little children smoking cigarettes. And ultimately, the questions are, can we really trust ads when it comes to public safety? I'm not sure why we do, but it seems like many people do, or they don't think about it is probably more likely the case. And anyway, and how do we really separate facts and fiction and truth from propaganda? Okay, so just to take things out of context, once upon a time, smoking was actually good for your health, right? Promoted for pregnant women and all the wonderful benefits there on the left. You can read about it. Growing to 100 years old, your doctor and your children and the mother listening to their doctor, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, science was even settled at some point, even though by 1920s, we maybe even go back to 1800s, we probably knew smoking was a causal factor in cancer, but that didn't stop the CDC in FDA coming out and saying cigarette smoking does not cause cancer, and with a doctor smoking, smiling, whatever. Okay, kind of get the idea here. So we, the public, the people on here, have responsibility. So there'll be a couple things maybe that we haven't heard from before that we really need to promote and push much harder. And our responsibility is to be informed, engaged, and then to enjoy the process, whatever that is, because that's important. Otherwise, people will just disengage and not get involved. And what we really need to do is weigh benefits, dangers, and alternatives to any new product. And yes, 4G is a product. We can also refer to it as a technology, but it's being sold to us, okay? So it's a product, and we should have a seat at the table. And when we don't, all of us should be standing up and saying what's going on, especially when there are the dangers that I'm going to be presenting, which have been well known for 100 years, okay? So what can we do? Well, first, whether it's us or our elected representatives, which are our public servants, we're supposed to hunt for reliable sources, facts, and information. That takes effort, that takes work. We need to know what it means to weight scientific evidence. Fortunately, the courts, like the Supreme Court and most court systems, they've well defined how they weight scientific evidence. We're just not using criteria like the courts use for doing that. We've decided to look at one-line headlines and newspaper articles, or what the conversation is at dinner on Friday night or something. And we have to take the responsibility to do much better than that and to teach people how to think and how to think critically. So that's our responsibility. And part of that is to demand rigorous scientific discourse and bring back the public debate. I'm trying to do that here, both at the university and locally. We must have open, transparent public debates. So anybody pushing a technology or a policy is getting up on stage and defending their ideas with everybody to watch. I believe there's a demand for this. I believe you make this a primetime event, you would get a huge turnout. The challenge will be to get both sides to show up, because you probably will imagine which side may not show up. I'd like to see which expert who's familiar with the literature would defend the safety or the inconclusive scientific evidence of the dangers of microwave radiation. We may find it be very difficult to get somebody up on stage. However, that doesn't mean we can't, in a real public debate, the sides are assigned to the individual. So a real debater has to take that side and do the best they can, regardless of what their personal opinion is on the topic, right? So this is about public discourse, public debate, and also recognizing logical fallacies, which are all over the place right now. We're getting information, every other word is a logical fallacy, and then we're listening to it, okay? So we got to get past that. And most importantly, our local elected representatives are our first line of defense to protecting us, life, property, liberty. And when they're not doing the job, they must be replaced, okay? And there's a process of doing that, some of which we may know and some we don't, okay? When it comes to the Federal Telecommunication Act, thank you from Susan Clark, this slide, it's actually very protective, and we don't think of it that way. The intent, the primary purpose in both the original, the formation of the FCC in 1934, and the one that we're more familiar with in 1996, they both refer first and foremost to promote the safety of life and property. And when that was the intent of the original 1934 law, there is no act that can come later to change the original intent. They can put words in there, but they're basically invalid. They need to be challenged and then eliminated from any act that tries to infringe on that. Okay, so this is very important. And the reason in 1934 the FCC was formed, and the reason that it's promoting safety of life and property, is because we had so many problems with radar stations before that time. It was obvious. You hear clicking and nausea, and the military had microwave. It wasn't secret. Even by 1934, we knew this. Okay. All right. So a local telecom ordinance first also must align with our core values. So you got to decide what those are, and hopefully safety to your life and property and your children, all that is part of your core values. And then you make sure that they align to them. Okay. In our state constitution, we actually have, in Arizona, we have very good protective statements I'm listing 3 there that guarantee that these be preserved, and there is no legislation that can remove, take, or infringe on these rights. Okay, so we have to remind the public servants of their oath of office, and in Arizona, they take an oath to defend the state and federal constitutions first and foremost above everything else. Okay, so if they're not, then they're violating their oath of office, and there's a process to hold them accountable when they're not following their oath of office. I believe whether it's in this topic here today or in other medical areas or research or anything else, you must demand disclosure of all financial conflicts of interest, especially because that can drive an agenda if you're not careful. And if you have a conflict of interest, you may have to remove yourself from the decision-making process. And it's up to the public to make sure that that's happening. Okay. Identify the local elected reps who will advocate for you. I don't know if anybody's on tonight. You definitely want to try to find at least one, because that can make a big difference if you've got one person you can work with. I can say in Arizona or in Tucson, we don't have anyone. We tried for 2 years, not a single person would be our advocate. In fact, I'd probably say the opposite, but and then finally, this is something that I know a few of you are just starting to learn about. Some of you have tried this, but it's kind of like there's a lot of ways you can approach notices and affidavits. And one of the things I've done from the beginning when I started to get involved with this, I look for the very, very few people that have success stories, stopping towers, getting new ordinances passed. And in this case, successful use of notices and affidavits, successful, okay? I'm focusing on successful. Not that I wrote a notice and affidavit and it didn't work, no. There's a process to this. In some cases, it can take a while, but it seems to work if it's done properly. Now, most of the things that we're familiar with the last couple of years, some of the groups that we're familiar with have been very successful at, for example, stopping mandates using these, seeing institutions reverse their policies. Number 2, forcing forensic audits of the 2020 election, including Maricopa County. That wasn't done because the legislature said, hey, let's do an audit. 1,500 people sent in affidavits saying you will be held responsible personally if you don't fix what's going on and do an audit, okay? So that's what initiated. And finally, as another example, returning children from CPS, the experts that have been helping us in Tucson draft something for the 5G community, have recovered almost 100 children from CPS, and that is very difficult to do, getting them back to their parents using notices and affidavits, and as quickly as 48 hours, by the way. So think about that. Okay, so there's a strategy. There's a strategy that fails, and I can tell you for 2 years, I've tried this, and there are strategies that seem to work much better, okay? So now as we kind of transition into some of the problems with 5G for the rest of my talk, and then we'll kind of end more with the health stuff. I'm going to hit the last 2 first to get them out of the way, privacy and property value. But we're going to talk about some of the problems with densely placed 4G, 5G infrastructure, and here's kind of the bullets. First of all, it's a public safety problem. I try to use that term, public safety, because it's everywhere in our laws, state, local, and especially federal telecommunications laws. Public safety must be preserved, and it's just terminology that works well. And public safety includes health, but it includes other things: noise, quiet enjoyment of our streets, noise, other things. There's many other things that go into public safety. So it's a nice term to use. As we're going to learn is that 4G, 5G removes privacy and security and intercepts data and can even steal someone's identity. Really not very good secure 5G Wi-Fi networks. And this is acknowledged by industry. It reduces property values by an average of 20%. I think you guys had a study in Pennsylvania that showed that we cite. And even the Housing and Urban Development refers to these cell towers as nuisance and hazards. And in California and other states, they actually have to disclose them, even if it's reserved to be a location, hurting your property. And who's paying for that, right? Why is the homeowner paying for something because somebody decided to put a pole in front of your bedroom window or something? And then ultimately, I don't know if I have another slide on this, but some of you probably know that You cannot get insurance for a microwave radiation. Okay, that's known as exclusion 32 from the insurance companies like Lloyd's of London, which means your city probably has more liability than they even realize. They think they might have insurance, they don't. Not for damage from the microwaves, which will happen or are happening. Okay, so privacy is another category, which in some ways may be the most frightening of all, even more than the health side of it, to be honest with you. But you could make an argument there. So we already kind of know that microwaves can see through walls. It's the technology used, the millimeter wave technology, which is above 30 gigahertz at the airports. That's been looking through our clothes every time we want to go on a plane. So you can have microwave cameras that can look through buildings and see things and track things, right? It's all about 24/7 surveillance. We talked about that with the security flaws and hacking government and company data. And then pulse microwaves actually, even from the small cells, even from your cell phone, can produce audible and inaudible noise. And it brings that to the quiet enjoyment of our streets, okay? So a telecom ordinance really needs to work on protecting privacy. So just to make one point about noise, people say, oh, can you hear microwaves? Of course you can hear pulse microwaves, and you don't need that much energy. If you got the right background and it's quiet, the right pulsing, this is called the microwave auditory effect, okay? This was well published by 1961 there, you can see that. And there's a whole book on it in 1978 by Professor Lin, who's the University of Illinois. Alan Fry there, 1961. But basically, you pulse electromagnetic radiation, specifically microwaves, at your temple window, and you can start to hear a sound. The first radar transmitters that went up, you would hear clicking sounds because it was pulsing on and off. The technology has become so advanced that you can actually encode just about any sound or voice you want into somebody's head. You can do that remotely. The CIA, and there are many patents on this, by the way, but the CIA will refer to this as voice to skull technology, V2K, you probably heard of that. NSA tends to refer to it as synthetic telepathy. So you can look up a lot of the terms, learn a lot about these things. Yeah, you kind of transition, well, this could be used as a weapon. Of course, someone else injecting a voice into your head, to me, is kind of like a weapon. But it was also proposed as a treatment to aid deaf people, right? This is using the thermoacoustic effect. It's something that we use in my lab for research for imaging purposes, where you're actually generating sound from pulsed electromagnetic fields, and you can collect those sounds to make images. That's something that we do. But in this case, it was actually proposed to restore sound or hearing to deaf people that might have had inner ear damage, but still function of their cochlea, okay? So that would be a completely different talk to go into some of the different, more subtle ways you can use microwaves intentionally. I don't want to do that here. I have presented a little bit on that before, but we're gonna stick to really what's out there that most people are talking about. So 5G technology has been proposed to govern society. Well, how do I know that? This is about 2018, 2019, an image from a basically social crediting and social engineering system about a city that was proposed in China for 2020. I believe it was Wuhan, China was the first smart city, which is now in full effect there. But it's basically this idea, you can see there, the system intends to monitor, rate, and regulate the financial, social, moral, and possibly political behaviors of China's citizens, and also the country's companies, via a system of punishments and rewards. The stated aim is to provide the trustworthy with benefits and discipline the untrustworthy, okay? Well, the CCP, China, you might understand why they want to do that. But you might also want to see why other governments around the world might kind of embrace this. And in fact, big tech was very much involved in writing the software for smart cities in China, which are really the first main ones to roll out there. And the idea here is that, yeah, you've got this whole list of ways to socially engineer people to behave certain ways. And unfortunately, this technology requires everything connected in real time and controlled remotely. This is if you can call it a side effect of the technology, but unless we have a seat at the table, this very well might be used against us, okay? So we got to make sure who's involved in the decision-making process. And if it's not you and me and our public servants representing us, then I would have serious questions about how this technology is and will be used, okay? So let's look at China, a couple examples. Let's look at a 5G world in China and then decide if we really want something like that here. Here's my first example.
Constantly monitored by facial recognition cameras that are able to instantly put a face to a name. Now the Chinese are also ranked.
红色是表示你的专注力显示的很高，
Teachers at this primary school in China
蓝色是走神了，
know exactly when someone isn't paying attention.
白色就是你可能跟网络还没有连接好。
These headbands measure each student's level of concentration. The information is then directly sent to the teacher's computer and to parents.
他可以看到每个人的评分。
就是自己的脑子搞清楚，我感觉自己有个紧的。
This fifth grader whom we caught dozing off in class told us his parents punished him for low attention scores. China has big plans to become a global leader in artificial intelligence. It has enabled a cashless economy where people make purchases with their faces. A giant network of surveillance cameras with facial recognition. Police monitor citizens. Students wear uniforms with chips that track their locations. There are even surveillance cameras that monitor how often students check their phones or yawn during classes. Experts and citizens alike are sounding alarms about various aspects of the country's huge push into artificial intelligence. These classrooms are laboratories for future generations.
Okay.
Constantly monitored.
Okay, I'm going to go to my next slide here. Okay, one more example. Go to my internet. There we go. Bring this over. Big.
What she buys, how she behaves, is tracked and scored to show how responsible and trustworthy she is. It's called the social credit system, and in one version now being tested, a person's reputation is scored on a scale of 350 to 950. And Haoyu, with a good score of 752, is okay with it. In fact, most people are.
Is that mechanism pushes you to become a better citizen?
It's big data meets Big Brother, expanding how the government monitors, understands, and ultimately controls its 1.4 billion citizens.
这个是针对
Thanks to advances in artificial intelligence and facial recognition, and a web of more than 200 million surveillance cameras.
Are people bothered by privacy concerns?
we think the lot of camera keep safety is really good. We can accept it.
Companies are experimenting with the algorithms to help the government create the new national social credit system. The government also has pilot projects. In one, citizens are required to do hours of unpaid work to get benefits. And scores are docked for things like littering, a messy yard, gossip, even jaywalking. Video of offenders is shown on the local news. And information collectors like Zhou Aini are paid to report on their neighbors. Her quota, 10 entries a month. Like the man who carried a drunk person home. A good deed, she says. Good social credit gets rewarded with perks like cheap loans and travel deals. But a bad score means public shame and worse. Only lost a court case and didn't pay. Now he's on a government blacklist. I can't buy airplane or train tickets, he says, and the list goes on. Being discredited makes it hard to get a job or put kids in top schools. The social credit system will go nationwide next year, and few here are willing to criticize it, something that may pose a risk itself. For a bad score, and the life that comes with it.
All right, that was about 5 years ago, I think, that video, so it kind of gives you an idea. So hopefully you get a better picture of what this technology is really. It's not about a faster download on your phone, you know, or on your Netflix now. About something a little different. And it's not really that secret. It's just not always sold that way. Okay. So I think I have one slide here, which is pretty egregious when I was mentioning a tower, it's out of your consent or control, goes up within 100 feet of your house. You basically lose 20% of your property value, and your local elected representatives, your public servants, did nothing to protect you. They could have had telecom pay for that difference in your property value. They themselves could have put in some kitty to pay for that. Why are you paying for it? That's just a constitutional violation like I've never heard. That's called stealing property. So somebody needs to be held accountable. It's something as obvious as that. We don't even need to get to all the other things I talked about. And so we're kind of familiar with that. It's not that surprising, but nobody's being held accountable. Okay. So now let's get into the health stuff. For the rest of my slides, we're going to get into a little more detail on that. If it's not bad enough, what I already said, say bad enough, I did present what it's purported to do, and depending on who's controlling the technology, there could be some advantages of it. However, it's hard pressed to make a strong argument that pulse modulated microwave radiation is going to be the best way to deliver a world where people are healthy and prosperous. Okay, I'd like to see the argument. Okay, again, debate topic, right? Okay, so here's our spectrum. We can see where microwaves fit in there. It's that really 0.3 gigahertz to 300 gigahertz is that microwave spectrum. And industry has proposed using pretty much that entire spectrum. Although right now, most exposures we're getting are below 3 gigahertz. Most people are still getting most of their exposure from microwave radiation at home, from their Wi-Fi routers, from their cell phone from their cell phones, from their Bluetooth devices, from their AirPod, you know, these things, you're putting things. So as long as we're willing to do that, it's going to be very difficult to make a case that all these other devices coming out are perfectly normal or not. Okay, so the big difference though for me is that if we can make our own decisions about our devices, but when it becomes involuntary 24/7 exposure, which in the beginning probably might multiply by 100 our exposures of where we currently is, which is already not great, of course, that we have to draw the line because we no longer have a choice. There will be not inches spared on the planet if this were to be rolled out worldwide. And so I think now is the time we have to make decisions of how we want to move forward. And yes, microwave radiation is pretty much man-made. We go back 150 years ago, the primary source would have been from a thunderstorm, okay? So we call that xenobiotic radiation. It's foreign to life. One of the main things I want you to remember about microwaves is through the absorption, it actually can change the structure and size of molecules. Some people will tell you it doesn't work on the atomic level, like X-rays that can kick electrons out of orbit and therefore is not supposedly able to cause damage because it's quotes non-ionizing radiation. But before that term was even created, we already knew microwaves cause damage. Okay, but I want you to remember that it operates at the molecular level and larger scales because we're made of molecules and ultimately atoms. And that's one of the mechanisms that it causes damage. Okay. The other thing is that microwaves are highly absorbed by water is highly absorbed by microwave radiation, and our bodies are mostly are made of water. Okay, so that makes it extra reactive. Okay, I do want to point out that there are lots of different components to an electromagnetic wave, which makes it difficult to do research in this area, especially if you're going to do replicated research. However, it also does give you control about determining what types of types of electromagnetic signals might be unhealthy. I believe there are electromagnetic signals that can actually promote health. There's a whole field called electromedicine, energy medicine, This has been documented for 100 years of PhDs and MDs that use these principles for healing, which I'm very interested in. It just turns out the pulse modulated microwave band and type of signals is generally just not a great idea for our health. Okay. This was a video, I don't need to play it, but the point is that microwaves are invisible to your sight. But as I mentioned, you can hear them in the right situation audibly, but all of your cells, quotes, hear microradiation, they respond to that, they react to it, they're sensitive to it. Even if your senses may not directly perceive them, your cells are sensitive to this all the time, okay? So microradiation affects living systems at all scales. There are over 20,000 peer-reviewed and government studies. So there's a link to a searchable database where you can get to most of those. Cells are sensitive to microwave, not just intensity, which we all like to think about, oh, get further away from the tower and things will be great. No, that's only one parameter that's well known to be a factor. There are some cases where even lower intensities, there's indications may have more of an effect. There could be a few reasons for that. But I do want you to remember that it's the pulsing that is especially damaging. So if you have a continuous kind of wave, it still may not be a great idea, but it's not as damaging as the pulse modulation. Those are the pulses coming from your phones, your devices, the 5G, and sending the information transfer. It's that pulsations that's especially harsh on your cells, okay? And then the third thing that's not even recognized by the FCC or even the FDA in terms of the safety criteria is dose, okay? So if you've got a certain level intensity of pulsing microwaves and it's below some sort of guideline that's determined to be safe, it doesn't matter if you're exposed to that for 6 hours or 6 years. Your agencies are saying, oh, there's no real difference, it's safe, okay? Yet we got overwhelming number of publications that say otherwise, okay? So, and if you think the analogy with x-rays, it makes it more obvious, right? You want to kind of limit your exposure to x-rays because it accumulates over time. Well, the mechanisms are different, but the principles are still there. So these are just some of the favorite studies just to show you how broadly this has been researched. In fact, I would say there's been no environmental factor more thoroughly studied than the effects of microwave radiation on living systems. 25,000 peer-reviewed papers is far more than smoking and lead combined, right? We can make analogies, okay? But you can see here, Army, Navy, NASA, CIA, EPA. I love that paper from 1984, that 278 pages, everything you really need to know. DOD, NIH, WHO. I'm going to kind of pick up speed because I'm already 40 minutes in. I do want to just point out that I'm going to be focusing on the human health effects, but we can certainly look at animals, and this will take you a link to 120 peer-reviewed publications that look at animals and insects and plants in particular, and a report by UNESCO in 2016, which was a 15-year study. Okay, so this myth that microwaves only damage tissue from heat, that's just a myth. We've known that since very early on. Here's 3 things I mentioned. The microwaves can make the brain leaky, affecting the blood-brain barrier. We'll look at a few examples. Produce audible noise. I mentioned that. And it can also make things stick together like red blood cells. This is known as the Pearl effect. And when it happens to red blood cells, that's called the Rouleaux Syndrome. And there are lots of things that can cause that, but microwaves are one of them that can make your red blood cells stick together, which might inhibit its ability to deliver oxygen to your tissue, for example, okay? So we mentioned deform molecules like DNA, produce inaudible noise, cause stress response and a hormone release, insulin, cortisol, there's papers where you can look at that, suppress the immune system, and even alter normal brain signaling, the EEG. Very low levels of pulse modulated microwaves have been demonstrated to affect your EEG signals as well as human behavior. I won't go into too much of that, but something to think about. Some people will ask about the 60 gigahertz, which is a millimeter wave. You're starting to see more of this. There is some question of how safe specifically that wavelength is, because oxygen molecule, as you can see here at the lower left, has a very strong absorption at 60 gigahertz. And now it doesn't penetrate very far into your body. It's kind of pretty much your skin, a millimeter sort of depth penetration there. But your blood vessels have oxygen. Your blood cells have oxygen in them. And when they get hit with a pressure wave, that oxygen can get pushed out of the red blood cell. Some of you might be familiar with the Benz syndrome, right? For scuba divers, if you come up too quickly, the oxygen can leave your red blood cells. So there's been some literature doing that. I'm not going to go into that, but that's a very specific thing that might happen at 60 gigahertz. So this is a great paper from 1972 from the Navy, because it referenced over 2,300 papers of all kinds of what the military calls microwave sickness, affecting almost all parts of your body here. So it's a great resource. This WHO conference in 1973, a 3-day conference, the top people in the world convened in Warsaw. They weren't questioning whether microwaves had some sort of health effect. They were trying to figure out what the mechanisms were. And they were sharing everything from in vitro on the plate to animal to human to occupational health studies of the kind of things they were seeing. Okay, so that you can download, look up. I'm just showing some examples there. And really by 1975, this wasn't really a debate. It was, I guess we didn't, I mean, unless you live near a radar tower, maybe most people didn't think about it. But who would have thought a generation later we would start seeing cell towers picking up all over by the 1990s in areas? It would have been mind-boggling for people to have thought that, who are doing this kind of research. This is just one of the conclusions from that conference. They list all their conclusions of all the studies, they put things together. This is one of them. So microwaves interact with the electrical dipole moment of the biologic molecules. It can change the shape and size of the macromolecules. And then the structural abnormality at a molecular level can cause disease, manifest in disease and damage, kind of like sickle cell anemia. When your hemoglobin changes shape, it no longer functions properly, and that's sickle cell anemia. Okay, so anytime you change the structure and form of something, you're playing with fire. Okay, at 1965, we had the Foreign Foundation. This is all about the central nervous system, 100-page document, all the different things of how these pulse microwaves can affect the central nervous system in particular. So you kind of wonder why. I guess you wouldn't be surprised to see in modern day all the warning signs of harm to your central nervous system from microwave radiation. So this was in 2019. The conclusion was a major contribution for the relative sudden upsurge in neurological morbidity in the Western world, 89 to 2015, is because of increased background EMF. And here they're looking at microwave primarily. The unprecedented neurologic death rates, all within just 25 years, demand a re-examination of long-term EMF safety related to the increasing background EMF on human health. I mean, can't be that surprised, right? Based on what was happening in the 70s. Here's another one looking at, this is in rats though, at 2.4 gigahertz, long-term exposure of microwaves induced anxiety-like behavior and showed necrotic apoptotic amygdala cell death after EMR exposure. Your amygdala is the brain structure that's related to your emotions and fear. We'll get back a little bit more in a second to the brain. Just another one. This is 2017. There are substantial increase in neurologic deaths in most countries, significant. So in America, well, America has one of the least stringent, most lenient thresholds for exposure guidelines for microwave radiation. England, United States, and I believe Canada maybe, have far more lenient guidelines than all other countries in the world. Just to compare, China and Russia are 100 times more stringent on their public allowable exposure levels in terms of power, okay? So just as a comparison, there are some places like Austria that's 10,000 times less their maximum exposure, okay? Of course, we've had also cell phone and, you know, our technology, so we've had more exposure from that within that time period, okay? So shouldn't be surprising. And there have long been attempts, to legislate, to create more safe rules to protect people. This was from Duke, and they outlined what they would do to help protect. Anybody can download that and see what they had proposed in 1979. All right, so I want to mention this study because it's the largest ever conducted by the National Toxicology Program. They were requested by the FDA to conduct a large study after the FCC went to the FDA in the 1990s saying, you know, people keep coming to us saying cell phone radiation is making them sick. Will you please just do a study to finally answer this question to get these people off of our back, right? And the FDA says, sure, we'll do that, but we don't have any expertise. We'll have to go to the National Toxicology Program because they have the experts to do the study. So this is a multi-center, independently controlled, $30 million study in both mice and rats, because you can never do this on humans based on what we know in the literature, right? So you could do it in mice and rats, gold standard. And over the last 2 or 3 years, they've now published several studies, including in both mice and rats. They revealed 9 different types of cancer, specifically brain, heart, and prostate. And heart cancer is kind of unusual, so that should be kind of alarming when you see something like that. Cardiac myopathy was also, which is enlarged heart. And just as importantly, genotoxicity, DNA damage caused by microradiation. So it's not just X-rays. Microwaves can alter DNA, okay? Well, that's not a surprise either, because the largest study in Europe, the reflex study, European Commission 2004, concluded the same thing. And here you're comparing, this is called a COMET assay to look at DNA damage. They're comparing 1,600 chest X-rays with gamma radiation. And then on the right, they're using 1.8 gigahertz mobile phone, 24 hours exposure. Okay, so I mean, you got to think of the constraints of the study, but the bottom line is there's evidence, even in this study, that microwaves cause DNA damage, and that's mutations, and that can lead to all kinds of other diseases when you have things on that scale. And that wasn't actually original. We had plenty of studies in the 1990s that demonstrated DNA damage. Okay, so replication is very important. So when we get to science and we talk about debates, we must demand replicated studies, because they're not happening now. We're not doing replicated studies. You can't say something's inconclusive because we don't fund to replicate studies that have shown an effect. That's a problem in our funding agencies and the public not demanding replication of those studies. In the case of microwaves with 25,000 papers, we got a good database to work from. So again, I can go down. So this, obviously, if you get mutagenic effects, chromosomal damage, you're going to get to cancer and other types of diseases. This is from the Air Force, 1988. That was declassified in 1988. I'm sorry, it's declassified in 1994, or released in 1994, yes. But that's Air Force. You'll have these. I'm just going to start listing. So mitochondria, which is the energy source to fuel the cell. Lots of evidence that microwaves produce oxidative stress. Just the absorption in your skin can reveal changes in your blood, okay, and stress response. We'll have access to that. Microwaves are an immune suppressor. Okay, this was 2020, a review paper referenced over 100 papers demonstrating how microwaves suppress the immune system. Probably not great during a pandemic. Be nice to know that the microwaves are not actually helping you during this time, right? All right, let's talk about the brain a little bit. I'll try to speed things up and finish here by 6 o'clock, okay? Blood-brain barrier opening, so a leaky brain. So I'm referencing some papers there, some mechanisms on the left, how to do that. Let's look at a couple studies, what that looks like. This is using more cell phone radiation. You can see how you start to see these spots in the brain. So what is that? Well, you inject a contrast agent that normally would not leak into the brain. And so when you see the little spots going into the brain tissue, out of the vascular system and into the brain, the neurons and the cell structures, that means you have a leaky brain. And this is comparing a control to something that was exposed at relatively low exposures for a period of time. And this had been replicated a few different ways, right? So when you have a leaky brain and things can get into your brain that it's not supposed to, think about heavy metals, think about viruses, right? Those are the kind of things that your brain is, the blood-brain barrier is there to protect you. This looks like you don't want to have that compromised. And this one goes back to 1975. They reported the same thing in this rat study, what they called subchronic pulsed microwave exposure. Okay, so nothing new, many studies on this. Here's one where a neonate was exposed to 900 megahertz can see the exposures level that would be within guidelines of say FCC. And you're seeing neuronal damage of the exposed neonate after born and seeing behavioral deficits that are described in this paper compared to the controls. You can see how the shapes change during the development stage because of the microwaves, or that's reported. Again, I'm just listing these. I know that there was interest here specifically in the brain, so I'm kind of just listing these. You can go look these up afterwards. Yes, it's been proposed that microwave radiation may be a causal factor contributing to early onset Alzheimer's disease. Well, based on what I just showed you, that shouldn't be dramatically surprising, but we need to be able to do those controlled studies. There could be other factors. We do know that in addition to the amyloid plaque that you hear a lot about with Alzheimer's, we also know that Alzheimer's patients have quite a bit of aluminum in their brain. You can imagine if you have aluminum plus microwaves and you're getting increased exposures, the two kind of work together. So those things have to be looked at as well. When you look at distance from a cell tower, you can see these 16 kind of effects that people experience, from fatigue to nausea to headaches, migraines, depression. And you can see as you get closer to living near those towers, you tend to see more and more of those sorts of symptoms, okay? And there's many more of these types of studies. And there's also epidemiologic. We talked about controlled studies where you're trying to control all the variables and look at one causal factor. You can do that in animals and other ways, but in humans, it's very difficult to do that. So you got to do epidemiologic studies. There are many epidemiologic studies that suggest dangers and harm from mobile phones and cell phones, towers, etc. Okay, I'm just giving you a example there. And the idea here is that these small cells with 5G, they're small, but they're not really small when it comes to power. In fact, if you live near these, you're going to tend to get much more power into your second-story bedroom window, as the example here, compared to a macro tower that is, in this case, 2,500 feet away. You can compare that to a small cell that's 60 feet away from your bedroom window, and much smaller in height, and you can see 25 million times more power compared to the equivalent macro tower 2,500 feet away, okay? These are actually measurements taken from, this is from San Francisco. Paul McGavin's helped make these measurements, so they've actually been able to quantify this and do that comparison. So when you be careful with the word small with these, they're sending out kilowatts of power. And you can get a meter like this. This is me near my mom's house, where I grew up, not far from where I am now, taking measurements 24/7. There's a cell tower there, a 5G tower. And then at night, it's pretty much 24/7, so you can kind of see the reading. So anybody that can get one of these types of things for $150 and get an idea of what their exposures are. Okay. So what happens? Consequences of too much power. Okay. I'm not going too much into law in this, but it is important to understand that in many cases the law is protecting you and you don't realize it because we're not taking advantage of it. But in general, the towers are required by law to be able to provide voice and text. That's called personal wireless services. Industry has defined that as 5 bars on a cell phone. That's what they're supposed to be providing. All the extra stuff of streaming, that's if you want it. You know, the regulations don't really go down to this huge Internet of Things, Internet of Body stuff. It's to provide 5 bars in a cell phone, which is defined by industry here as this kind of power level on the right. But as you increase your power levels and you get towards the FCC guideline, which is at the bottom, you start to see more and more problems with illness, side effects, et cetera, right? So we really want to limit the amount of power that's being delivered from the cell phone towers. And there are ways in the law, there's different rules, and you look at it to take that up. People are trying to do that. But the industry really wants as much exposure as possible because that's how they're connecting the devices, right? They need to connect a bunch of stuff. But technically, the regulation is limited on what they can do there, okay? So that's an important distinction you want to know. I do want to point out that children are obviously more vulnerable because their skulls and their bones are thinner. So that makes their brain especially vulnerable because it gets into their head, and their bone marrow becomes vulnerable, okay? Many countries have been known this for a long time. France has banned Wi-Fi from their schools, especially middle school and younger, for 10 years at least. And they're here, I'm just showing a few other countries just to get an idea that have taken strong action against Wi-Fi in schools. I mean, even China last year about this time said, all right, no more smartphones. You know, they recognized all kinds of problems. So they don't have smartphones as of February 2nd, 2021. I don't know if that's true, but that's what the China Ministry of Education said. And so, you know, we just seem to be behind the times, right? Other countries seem to be more aware of the problem here. So I did want to mention a couple of tools, not that I do this, I'm familiar with the technique, but there are people out there that use tools to look at effects of the microwaves. One of them is called dark field phase contrast imaging. You can look at the human blood after in vivo exposure to microwaves. It's supposed to look on the left, it looks like healthy, nice and circular, not sticking together really, right? And then you start to look at with low exposure, 75-year-old, carrying exposure, active exposure, they start to change. They're not even circular anymore, they're sticking together. So these are things that have been described. There are papers here. In this case, I provide a link to studies at Weston Price. You can look at those. That's also called Rouleaux Syndrome. I mentioned that earlier. And this pearl effect, pearl formation, this was published in 1974. It goes into some detail about how microwaves can charge particles and then make them stick together, kind of thing, is one of the mechanisms called the pearl effect or pearl formation. So another idea for assessment to measure your blood composition, like hormone, insulin, blood sugar levels, which are modulated by microwave exposure. Here I'm looking at diabetes because I had a special request to look up a couple things. So Magda Habas has done quite a bit of work in this area. You can read the quotes there. I won't read them, but you can basically use signals in the blood as a barometer because you can have them exposed, have them move away for a few hours or a day, measure them again, move them closer. You know, you can kind of do experiments and kind of get an idea that way, and see how much it's affecting you, right? Because each person might be a little different. And this is, again, just the conclusion here is the effect of EMF, microwaves, as well as other types of dirty electricity. You can take these personal records, if you can measure these in blood sugar levels and see how it relates to your exposures, your microwave exposure, okay? So that's something that somebody could do, get an idea. And just show that this is pretty widespread, this understanding. In this case, this is diabetes 2. That here students who were exposed to high microwave radiation had significantly higher risk of type 2 diabetes. And then this upper left study was in rats at Bluetooth sort of frequencies compared insulin secretion and increased oxidative stress in the cells themselves, rat pancreas. So this is right down to the mechanism level, right? I'm taking you to the cellular in vitro all the way to the epidemiologic. They're all making, there's a pattern here. The pattern's been there for a long time. All right, so what could you do? You probably can find these on the internet. Does that mean I don't use any wireless devices? I don't know if I could survive exactly if I didn't. I try to have good habits. If I feel like I'm sick or have a headache or something, I'm going to definitely pay more attention, or especially if I had a more serious condition or chronic disease, I'm going to maybe do more troubleshooting. But these are all really good skills and to develop good habits of our own devices, to take responsibility. Because if we're not even willing to do that, you know, are we really going to pay attention, or do we even justified to say too much about the cell phone tower? So it doesn't mean we don't use the devices, but we do have to be proactive and try to make sure we're using the safest type of technology to perform the function that was doing. So you can see here airplane mode. You know, a lot of people don't know that that cordless phone, not the cellular phone, the cordless phone at home is a 24/7 cell phone tower. Those things are click, 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 click 24/7. If you actually have a meter, you can measure that. It's easy to take your cordless phone at home and replace it with something with a cord like I do, or not have a phone, you know, or use something with a cord. you're going to feel better and you don't need that Wi-Fi. Turn your Wi-Fi off at night. If you really have to use Wi-Fi, you can get a timer. You can also directly wire. I'm directly wired here sitting at home, and it's much faster, by the way. So there's lots of options. So I'll leave that as a reference for you guys. Here's some great books that I recommend. I have many other sorts of references, but you'll learn a lot about from these books. And we also have to think about better technology. The 5G doesn't even meet the standards of the Department of Treasury for bandwidth and speed, right? Here, 5G is 10 gigabytes. Here, second. Fiber is 100 terabytes. It's not even close, okay? Much faster, of course, much safer. Chattanooga, Tennessee embraced fiber more than 10 years ago. It was a very difficult decision to navigate that. And they are really networked with fiber everywhere. Now, that's to the premises, fiber to the premises. That's to the resident, to the business. Once you get it to there, whoever lives there or is using the facilities, they can decide inside their building how they want to spread out the internet. They could use Ethernet, they can use Wi-Fi. But the point is, you don't break it at the curb and put a tower there. You bring the line all the way to the premises. And that's a great solution. Safe, much faster, harder to hack, although you probably can. And for Chattanooga, it was a boom to their economy. Last year, they reported almost $3 billion in economic benefits from this decision. Other cities are looking at this as a model. You will find elected representatives saying, oh, I really like it, but then they don't do anything because there's a lot of other interests pushing people around, okay? I won't talk about that. I'll just mention, I do think there are maybe alternative wireless technologies that don't use microwave radiation. And I'll just refer you to the wireless telephone call that took place between New York and Honolulu in 1915, using a technology that Nikola Tesla developed. Where did this go? How did it work? These are open conversations for public discourse and debate. I believe there may be some very interesting technologies we're not even looking at because we're not paying attention to, okay? The Earth is a great conductor. Sending things through the air may not always be the best solution for wireless communication. Anyway, so we tried everything here in Tucson for 2 years. Very difficult to meet with anybody. We didn't have anybody to advocate. It was pretty much ignore, ignore, ignore. We wrote all the letters we wanted. We even got the best people together, wrote an ordinance. When our Tucson City Council made a motion to amend their ordinance on February 23rd, 2021, we said, we need to beat them to the punch. Let's write our own ordinance and deliver it to them. We did a month later. And what did they do? Well, they proceeded to publish a utility manual that required no vote, did not amend the ordinance. That went published in August. It didn't even referred it to the electric and Tucson Electric, and it wasn't even all Wi-Fi towers, right? They violated what they said they were going to do in February, never had a vote and never amended anything. And basically, what can you do when nobody wants to listen and you're basically ignored? So we've tried everything we could, but it is a model of an ordinance that you can see how we can take advantage of the law. Arizona has a very difficult state bill. It was the first state to pass a state law. I don't know if Pennsylvania has one, but however, just navigating the existing laws, the state laws and federal laws, there are so many things that your local city council could do that they're just ignoring or acting like their hands are tied, okay? So they're violating their oath of office because of that. So we are now re-examining at this solution of notices and affidavits, but this time doing it correctly by working with experts that have a track record of success. And these are pretty much volunteers. I asked Rosemary to be on if she's on with Affidavits Mamas, if there are questions on this, but we are very close to having final drafts, hopefully in the next week, for Tucson to send to our elected city representatives to tell them that they're violating their oath of office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there are multiple notices we've already prepared, okay? Putting them on notice and holding them responsible, but now we have to understand how this process works, notices and affidavits, et cetera. I know that Susan Jennings and Donna Ott, they were on our call last Sunday, just trying to get up to speed on this. But the key is there are volunteers. Some of them are really working all over the country in other areas, not just the 5G, which is interesting because the 5G thing is new to them. They've been going after other things. Now they're really getting up to speed to the 5G problem. So I'm very hopeful that this will be not just a good solution for Tucson, who is, I guess, in some ways taking the lead to get a template down. That template can then be used and shared with other communities. I think in other cities in Arizona, they can almost use the same exact ones because we're referring to the state constitution a lot. For other states, you're going to want to go into your state constitution, kind of find the best language, probably. But the key is there are volunteers that will actually now help you do this. This is the cool thing. The other thing is, because this focuses on the Constitution, all of us have jurisdiction, meaning you guys can send in a notice for us in Tucson, and it actually carries weight. We can help you in Pennsylvania by sending in notices and even affidavits, which need to be notarized. So people all over the country can actually contribute to other communities. And the people working with Affidavit Mamas and some people locally here, they have massive outreach, so they will typically get even thousands of notices sent out for other things. So getting big numbers is a part of it, okay? So I'm gonna stop there. And I know I've got all kinds of questions. I kind of went a little bit way past where I wanted to, but hopefully this will be a great resource for you guys. And Rose is on here, so she's with Affidavits Mamas. So if there are any questions specifically on that part of it, I will probably defer them to her because she's one of the experts with a lot.